In a year when Canadians were dragged to the polls for an election no one wanted that got us back to where we started in the first place, Albertans were also trudging to the polls for a referendum on the Equalization Program to gain leverage with the federal government. The results, 61% voting yes to remove equalization from the Constitution. Will it ever happen? Hello and welcome to Unpublished TV. I'm Ed Hand. We're coming to you from a remote location and practicing physical distancing to enhance safety. The referendum was a campaign promise by Jason Kenney and the United Conservative Party. Equalization basically distributes wealth to have-not provinces, primarily at the expense of Alberta and Ontario. What some Albertans see or don't like is the fact that funds are being given to provinces which have stifled Alberta's perceived growth. Think Quebec not allowing a pipeline through its land. Now, there are some nuances to adding up what each province will get. For example, in the calculation, the value of natural resource development can have an impact. It could give provinces the incentive to not develop those resources. Jason Kenney's not the first premier to want to change the Constitution. Doug Ford in Ontario used the notwithstanding clause to get legislation through. Quebec wants to open it up to enshrine French as the official language of the province and declare itself a nation. Our unpublished .vote question asks, do you feel Canada's equalization program should be changed? 88.9% said yes, 9.7% said no, 1.4% were unsure. Now, however you're watching and listening to our show, whether through our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or our podcast channels, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more, I'd like to remind you that you can still cast your vote on this topic at unpublished.vote and then email your MP to tell them why. Now, joining us to discuss the referendum and whether it will lead to change or the feds will just ignore it, Warren Kinsellas, the former advisor to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, as well as a political commentator. Janet Brown is the principal at Janet Brown Opinion Research. Daniel Ballin is a professor and director of the Institute for the Study of Canada at McGill University. And Stephanie Chouinard, assistant professor of political science at Queen's University. And Stephanie, we'll start off with you. Alberta says it feels it's being treated unfairly in equalization. Is it?
I mean, it's a question that all provinces can ask when they become half provinces, right? And we've seen this here in Ontario when in 2019, then Finance Minister Bill Morneau called up Doug Ford and said, you're going to be on the have side of the provinces this year, and so Ontario has been ever since. And then Ontario thought that the calculation was suddenly unfair, right? So there's a lot there to unpack. And obviously, if you're looking through time, some provinces have benefited from equalization for more years than others. But at the end of the day, every province in the Federation have at some point benefited from equalization.
Warren, what do you think? Do you think Alberta, it says it's being untreated and unfairly in equalization? Do you feel it is?
What I think probably doesn't matter. Honestly, the problem with this referendum, and I expressed this to Alberta friends who are pushing for a bigger yes result, the principal advocate for the change was Jason Kenney. Jason Kenney is the most unpopular politician in Canada. And whether that's fair to him or not, the bottom line is I thought it was a mistake for him to be pushing the referendum at this time because he was the guy in the window advocating for it. So it became a little bit of a referendum on him as well. When you do a referendum, because regrettably in Canada we have some history with this, you need a popular leader like a Levesque. You need a simple question, one that isn't hard for people to understand. And you need passion. You need people worked up over the issue. And I know from coming from Alberta, people in Alberta are like everywhere else. They were concerned about the cost of living. They were concerned about the pandemic. They were concerned about political representation. But the equalization formula just wasn't in their top 10 list for many of them. And I think that's why we got the result that we did.
What do you think, Janet? Alberta feels it's being untreated or being treated unfairly with equalization. I'm under the impression that you feel that's the case.
Well, Alberta is feeling like it's treated unfairly, and equalization has become the flashpoint to that. And equalization has sort of become a symbol for all sorts of unfairness. And as Warren said, there were so many complications with this referendum. It's hard to take the referendum at face value. So all those things he talked about, Jason Kenney's the most unpopular premier in Canada right now. And I would say that, Jason Kenney is fast becoming the most unpopular politician Alberta has ever had, at least sort of in the memory of polling over the last 25 years. You also said off the top that, we voted in a federal election and then Albertans voted in an equalization referendum. Well, no, actually, we had a municipal election. And here in Calgary, there were 7 questions on the ballot. And this was just one of them. And so, people were dealing with a whole bunch of questions that they needed to answer. Or we didn't have an incumbent mayor here in Edmonton. There wasn't an incumbent mayor, or in Calgary, we didn't have an incumbent mayor. They didn't have an incumbent mayor in Edmonton. So anyway, it was just a really, really complicated election. And this equalization question was added on. And then the equalization question didn't ask Albertans whether they wanted to change the formula. It asked them whether they wanted the principle removed from the Constitution. So I think it left Albertans in a really awkward position. The vast majority of Albertans don't like the formula. They want the formula to change. But that doesn't mean that Albertans don't think equalization is a valid principle, and is that it, in my focus groups, what people tell me is they don't mind the principle of equalization, it's the formula. So Jason Kenney asked them to vote about the principle, but in all his communications and all the paid advertising around it, people were asked to think about the formula. So at 62%, I think what that says is, because lots of polling shows that way more people are disgruntled with equalization than 62%. I think what the 62% says, what the low voter turnout says, is that Albertans were disgruntled, but they just didn't, the vast majority of Albertans didn't know what to do with this question. So the vast majority of Albertans didn't even answer the question.
Daniel, 62% voted for, obviously, the yes side here. But I found it interesting that when you looked at Edmonton, it basically voted no, and Calgary voted yes. What does that tell you?
Well, I live in Alberta for 6 years, and what I discovered when I moved there, after moving there, is that it was a much less homogeneous province than what people in Quebec or outside of Alberta in general think. So, and Janet is smiling because she knows that very well as a wonderful pollster. Edmonton, or Redmonton as it's known, is quite different politically than Calgary. And then you have the Bible Belt in the south of Alberta, and even in rural areas, you have also the oil belt further north and so forth. So I think you have different Albertas, and this is reflected in electoral results when you see, in Edmonton, the NDP at the provincial level is stronger. They can also win seats at the federal level. So I think it reflects internal disparities, political disparities or differences between Albertans, among Albertans in a province that's not as homogeneous as what people think. And many people in Edmonton, they just don't like Jason Kenney. Well, Jason Kenney, as Warren said, is the least popular premier in the country right now. So the timing of this referendum was not good for him. And I think the low participation reflects that in part. The participation in the 1995 Quebec referendum was 93.5. This time around, we talk about the participation rate of 39-40%. Yes, it was tied to the municipal elections, but if people were really, wanted to make that such a big issue, they would have voted in greater numbers. And so that's, I think, a problem for Jason Kenney, the low participation rate here, and the fact that he's so unpopular. So why would people in other provinces say, hey, we have to listen to what Jason Kenney is saying? Well, probably not.
Stephanie, leverage is what Jason Kenney said with this referendum. That's what he wanted, some leverage with the federal government. Do these results give Alberta any leverage?
Not very much. When you were talking about referenda, you want a sizable portion of the population to have partaken in order to have a clear mandate. So first of all, there was a very low participation rate. And second of all, the question itself, as well as the information that was provided to Albertans by Elections Alberta, faced a lot of criticism. First of all, when we're looking at the question that was asked, as Janet mentioned earlier, there's a disconnect between the question and the information that was provided by the UCP. And the other problem is, we can possibly remove equalization from the Constitution. It doesn't mean the federal government's going to stop paying it. The feds have been paying equalization since 1957, so way prior to 1982, and arguably would continue to do so, if only to ensure standardization of services across the Federation, particularly in Eastern Canada, that's facing some real challenges from the demographic perspective, so as to not see too much movement of population throughout the country. So that's another problem that we're having here, is that even Albertans who have strong feelings about equalization are not necessarily well represented by the results. And moreover, as was already mentioned, Mr. Kenney is not going to be the person taken most seriously around the table at the Council of the Federation. So he will probably have an ally in Scott Moe, but as far as the other premiers go, I'm not so sure that he's going to have a whole lot of people willing to side with him.
Warren, do you think the federal government will act on this referendum, or do you think it'll be ignored?
I think they will not act on it, and I think they will ignore it. They may say a few things, sympathetic noises and so on, but there's no political imperative there for Trudeau to react. The participation rate was low. There's no resounding demand for change in Alberta or anywhere, frankly. And quite frankly, I think that the impetus for this, so basically tinkering with the Constitution of Canada at the provincial level, we're seeing that in Alberta, we're seeing that in Quebec, we're seeing noises about that in places like Manitoba. I think that this is the universe that Mr. Trudeau has created for us, where constitutional change will become largely unilateral and incremental and done at the provincial level. So I regret that. That's not the Canada that I would like to see, but I think that's the Canada that we are going to have for the foreseeable future.
You expect that we're going to have a lot more of these situations where the Constitution, because I'll be honest, I'm surprised how much the Constitution has taken a beating in the last year and a half.
Yeah, people are preoccupied with other issues, I presume, the pandemic and so on. But Trudeau has facilitated this, and he got reelected. So there's been no repudiation of what he's enabled Alberta and Quebec to do.
Janet, in terms of the referendum, and what's Jason Kenney going to have to do to see this as a win for him and for Alberta?
Well, he started telegraphing what a win was a few days before the referendum, because I think when the idea was originally conceived, polling was indicating that, upwards of 70% of people thought that equalization was unfair. A couple of weeks ago, Maru Public Opinion put out a poll, and they found that 84% of Albertans thought aspects of equalization were unfair. So, it wasn't 2 years ago, it wasn't a big stretch to think that the right referendum question could have gotten a huge yes number. But as we got closer and closer, it looked like it wasn't going to be in the 70 or 80% range. So Jason Kenney just started talking about, all I need is a bare majority. It doesn't matter how many people turn out to vote. All I need is a bare majority. So, so he got his bare majority, and he's trying to spin this as a success. But, Trudeau's response was, I think, spot on. Jason Kenney said, look, if we have a majority of people who vote yes, I'll have some leverage to renegotiate equalization. Well, Justin Trudeau just turned around and said, no, you have a referendum to remove equalization from the Constitution, and that has nothing to do with me. Go find 6 other premiers who represent 50% of the population, go away. So this is why the question is so problematic, because now Justin Trudeau has the perfect reason to just turn around and say, well, no, you don't have a question to negotiate. You have a question that gives you leverage to get out of equalization. Go find your 6 premiers, go find your 50% of the population, have at it.
Daniel, I read your point or your article on equalization, and you say reforming the governance structure of the program will depoliticize it. How so?
Well, you cannot depolitize equalization entirely. What you can do, well, first of all, I think what we need now is actually to look at equalization, because there are actual problems with the formula that we have, which was adopted at the beginning of the Harper years. And the Trudeau government just renewed the equalization formula without changes. But I think that what we need to do now is look at the formula, because a lot of things have changed, especially since 2014, the fall in oil prices. And of course, since the beginning of the pandemic, we have actually less inequality among provinces now than some years ago. And equalization is there to reduce fiscal inequalities among provinces. So we need to probably create right now an expert body, which is something that Paul Martin did, more than 15 years ago, and to have people looking at the actual formula and how it needs to be updated, because the country is changing, the economy is changing, and we need to update this formula from time to time. And the time is now, or within the next few years, we need to do this. And I think Trudeau has to show leadership and do this, not because of the Alberta referendum, but because there are some challenges facing the program. Trevor Toome from the University of Calgary, an economist, published a piece on a website called financesofthenation.ca, which also has a cool equalization simulator where you can actually think about what will happen in the next few years. And it seems that it's possible, according to him and the simulator, that Saskatchewan, Newfoundland and Labrador, and perhaps even Ontario will receive equalization sooner rather than later. And when this happens, this will trigger different consequences for various provinces, including potentially a loss of revenue for Quebec. So many provinces might have actually, an incentive to push Ottawa to take a new look at equalization. But in the long run, we need a permanent commission like they have in Australia, where people who are outside of government, who are at arm's length from elected officials, to actually look at the equalization formula on a regular basis, rather than letting civil servants in the Department of Finance serve their elected political masters. And so having a permanent expert body is the way to go in the long run. But in the short run, we need a temporary, a kind of commission or a body of experts like the one created during the Martin years. And it worked well because Stephen Harper decided to adopt the recommendations of that expert body, although it had been really created by his predecessor, Paul Martin. Equalization is a very contentious issue. And sometimes you need to look at this, the numbers in a more detached way and let experts, economists, to understand the formula, which is very small minority of the population, to actually do their work and then come up with recommendations. And then you decide whether you want to adopt them or not. But change is needed.
You mentioned that there are challenges facing this program. What challenges? Just the fact that a lot of people don't like it?
No, it's not just that. There are actually challenges in the way that. So what happened under the Harper year, during Harper, is that we created a cap on equalization, but this cap has become a floor because we have less inequality among provinces now. So the system is just out of sync with the economic and fiscal reality of the country now. So we need changes, not dramatic changes. It's not about ending equalization or removing it from the Constitution. It's about tweaking or altering the formula, which we should do on a regular basis.
Stephanie, I'm wondering, how do you see this program being changed to make it more palatable to all provinces?
Well, I think the first thing is to start communicating how equalization actually works and what goes in and what goes out, because equalization has become a bit of a lightning rod in parts of this country. But as Danielle just said, the vast majority of Canadians, and I would argue even the vast majority of academics, don't even understand how it works and how the calculation works on a year-to-year basis. So there's a real job for the federal government here to start educating Canadians, start communicating exactly how it works, to demystify how this program works and what it does. And I think Danielle's point is excellent, to take it out of the political realm and to have a nonpartisan, unbiased committee who will have a hard look at how it works and where Canada's going in the next few years, and see how we can actually tweak that and also communicate what that work is, the tweaking that's being done, in order to come to a fairer assessment of who are the have and have not provinces, what are the real challenges that parts of the country are facing and will be facing in the near future, and even perhaps say so we will mandate future governments to do this and to strike this committee on a 10-year basis, perhaps the same way we do with electoral boundaries, for example, after every 10-year census. I think that would be something that would ensure that we don't get stuck in a formula that doesn't work for today's challenges.
What do you think, Warren? And if you put it, in a unbiased board group, whatever, do you think that takes the politics out of it, or somehow politics will always wind its way back into it?
Politics is like water. It always finds a way out. Like, honestly, what is Canada, guys? Canada is a series of fiefdoms bound together by resentment. And the principle, one of the best ways of articulating resentment is something like the equalization formula, because it's perfect, because nobody understands it, me included. Like, I work for a prime minister and I don't understand it. I can't communicate it. So that's why, as a number of your panelists have already said, it's the perfect vehicle for a politician to manipulate and take advantage of. So yes, I do believe depoliticizing it is the way to go. But at the end of the day, like international law, the decisions that body produces have to oscillate back into the political realm, and then it's a football again. So my prediction is, guys, we're going to all be talking about this on Ed's show about 20 years from now. Still.
Wow, we're still going 20 years later. That's good to hear, Warren. Janet, I have to ask, if there's going to be any change, it has to be approved by the House of Commons, the Senate, and 2/3 of the provinces. And that's an awful lot of agreement to get lined up. Do you think that could ever happen?
Well, as I said off the top, Albertans are disgruntled about a whole bunch of things, and equalization is just the flashpoint. So, I'm not a constitutional scholar. I can't even comment on the likelihood that this is going to happen. But let's say it even does happen. That doesn't necessarily squash Western alienation or frustration in Alberta, because this, like I said, has become more of a symbolic thing than an actual thing. And Stephanie is so right. There's very little understanding of equalization. Trevor Toome, who's been mentioned, he has worked tirelessly to try and educate people. But people really don't care about the mechanisms, right? Like, I remember standing in line on election day and listening to one of my neighbors say, now, how do I vote if I don't want Alberta to keep sending a check to Quebec? Well, of course, Alberta doesn't send a check to Quebec. That's part of the mythology around equalization. And actually, people would rather hang on to that misinformation because it reinforces their it's confirmation bias. It reinforces their belief. So, I think when you're talking about sort of Alberta's frustration right now, equalization is just a symbol. And I'm not sure that, even if you could come up with something apolitical in the perfect formula, there has to be the perception of the perfect formula, whether the formula is perfect or not.
Now, Daniel, obviously Quebec seems to get a lot of the abuse when it comes to the discussion about equalization, but Alberta isn't the only one contributing. I think that people forget that everybody in this country contributes, and then it gets distributed. And I think that's part of the problem, as Janet pointed out, the misinformation out there.
Yes, and the misinformation is not just in Alberta, by the way. It's all across the country. I mean, if we will do, a poll across the country, I think that this is something that Canadians share, not just that they like to fight over their territorial politics, as Warren said, but also that, the ignorance about equalization is widespread all across the country. So that's something that maybe brings us together in a negative way. But more seriously, I do think that what we are seeing now is not something new, obviously. We have, if you look at the work of Mary Janigan, for example, her book, Let the Eastern Bastards Freeze in the Dark, or The Art of Sharing on Equalization, we have been in this country fighting over territorial redistribution since 1867, and this is not something that will stop anytime soon. So Warren is right about this. At the same time, I think that we need to address some of the shortcomings of the equalization formula, and I agree with Stephanie that, and actually we have normally on a regular basis to reassess the formula. And last time around, the Liberals just said under Justin Trudeau, we won't talk about it, we just renew the formula and so forth. I think they could not do that next time around. Of course, there will be, I think that's why I said they should appoint an expert panel, preferably like last time under Paul Martin, it was an economist from Alberta, Al O'Brien, who's chaired the expert committee. So put an Alberta economist, perhaps, or someone from Western Canada in charge, but people who don't have a political stake in this, and let them put forward some proposals. And of course, when the proposals will be unveiled in a report, some provinces will be unhappy. We remember what happened when the last report came out, that what Danny Williams did. And, there was also some protest in Saskatchewan, but that back then under Calvert, it was because Saskatchewan was no longer receiving equalization, which is very different than what Scott Moe is saying today. So I do think that we need to look at this, and it takes political courage. And I'm not betting on this, that the Trudeau government will do this, but I think that it's in the best interest of the country to actually address the flaws of the current system without transforming it altogether, but at least looking at the issues rather than putting our head in the sand and just thinking that this will all go away.
Stephanie, I'm wondering if we just need some minor tinkering for this program to make everybody happy, or is this something that's going to need a large overhaul?
I mean, I wouldn't want to be at the head of this commission, quite frankly. I think there are a lot of ways that we can tinker with the formula, and I'm not sure that we will make everyone happy. Someone once said to me that a good compromise is a solution where nobody around the table is really happy. There will always remain some disgruntlement, whether it's from Alberta or from Quebec or from Newfoundland, for example, who often get stuck in the middle as an oil-producing province, but also a province that has had some pretty tough hardships economically. So honestly, I'm not sure that there's a perfect solution. There probably isn't. But I will chime in with Daniel there when he says that I don't think this government can afford to not do anything and not to try at least to address some of the grievances, despite the fact that, as Janet said, this alone will not solve Western alienation and resentment.
Warren, I guess Western alienation and resentment, that seems to be, I guess the thrust of this. Obviously, equalization is what they don't like, but the bigger feeling it seems to be is Western alienization as it is. Sorry.
It's okay. It's as complicated as the formula.
Yeah.
Like, look, right now in Calgary, I was talking to a bunch of friends there last week. Are they disappointed with the results? Some of them were organizers for the yes side. Yeah, for sure. But they're all focused on the price per barrel right now because they're all going to make it out like bandits over the next few weeks, before Mr. Chouinard brings down some real limits with respect to emissions. So, people are happy, people are sad. It kind of moves around. But I do think the expert panel is a good idea. And I would like to nominate Stephanie, Danielle, and Janet to lead it.
That's my suggestion. That's it. And you can.
I was going to nominate Trevor. I was going to nominate Trevor Toome, but as the token Albertan,
I would agree with Janet on that one. Absolutely.
But don't tell him I said that. He'll be very.
He'll be tuning in. Well, great
recording.
Great discussion, folks. I want to thank you for joining us. Our guest today on Unpublished TV, Warren Kinsella, former advisor to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien and political commentator. Janet Brown is the principal at Janet Brown Opinion Research. Daniel Balin is professor and director at the Institute for the Study of Canada at McGill University, and Stephanie Chouinard, assistant professor, political science at Queen's University. Now, coming up on the next Unpublished TV, we'll take a look at the new federal cabinet. Thanks for watching Unpublished TV. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.